on environmental and sustainability management, and we are basically focusing on how to work on its report preparation and how to prepare its assessment. So the basic title of the unit number 6 is Advanced Principles of Net Zero. The title basically means that we want to focus on how net zero can be achieved. What is net zero? What are the different advanced principles of it, and how they can be achieved in real time? By basically talking about net zero, we mean that we want to achieve a target, we want to reach a target of about zero or completely zero emissions by 2050 that need to be zero in total by the year 2050. The name of the diploma that we have is Diploma in Environmental and Sustainability Management, and it is basically a diploma that is stretching over an entire year and is expected to end by the end of the year 2024. You have a total of 120 credit hours, and the grading type is either that learner will be turned as pass or fail, and the basic study subject that we are working under is environmental conservation. So we had mandatory units as well as optional units. The mandatory units were four: fundamentals of sustainability, environmental science and energy transition, environmental management in organizations, and research methods. All four of these mandatory units have been explored. Their content has been learned, and also the report preparation guidelines have been provided. After that, we have finally moved to the optional units, which are the elective units, out of which two are the ones that have been elected by most of the candidates. Therefore, only these two will be explored. These two are Advanced Principles of Net Zero and unit number 9, Sustainability as a Business Strategy. So today we are focusing on Advanced Principles of Net Zero. What are the aims of this unit? The unit basically says that we want to focus, obviously, first of all, on what net zero is and how it can be achieved. What is carbon neutrality? And what is the what is the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality? Because both of these look like really similar terms and are also interchangeably used, but in reality, there is just a little bit of difference between these two, which will be explored later. And then, why are we talking about net zero so much? Why is it of so much significance? And then we will see how carbon emissions can be accounted, how they can be calculated, and how these can be reported, also known as greenhouse gas accounting. And then how organizations specifically, or different corporations, or different enterprises, different industries can set specific science-based targets for themselves and reach them in real time. And then what is climate change adaptation? What are different climate change resilience strategies? What are different climate change pledges that organizations are setting for themselves, and how they are having different green claims and are claiming to move towards this goal of net zero emissions by 2050? So the basic scenario of this unit number 6 is, which has been provided in the assessment brief, that you, that is the learner, is being hired is being hired by an organization which is FTSE 100, that is also known as the Stock Exchange of London, and your task is to develop a comprehensive essay. So basically, under this essay, you have to develop a basic report in which you will have to talk about how that organization, how FTSE 100 can reach the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. So you are basically there to help the organization with this task. The organization also wants to address this issue of climate change, obviously, and it wants to transition, it wants to move towards a sustainable economy, it wants to move a more resilient economy, and it wants to have economic prosperity, financial stability, and social stability at the same time. So the organization basically wants to have everything under one umbrella. It wants to have sustainability, it wants to have better economy, it wants to have better social equity, and so on. So your task is to prepare a comprehensive essay or a report for the organization in which you will tell how this organization can reach net zero by 2050. So the first question or the first assessment criteria that you have been provided in the assessment brief is that you will have to talk about net zero and carbon neutrality and what is the difference between these two and what is Paris Accord. The Paris Accord, also known as the Paris Agreement, is basically a part of the Conference of Parties or the COP. So this was basically passed in 2015 and talks about three main things. Number one, it wants you to limit your temperature to 1.5 degrees. Number two, it wants you, that is the organization or any industry, to report your emissions every 5 years. Number three, this Paris Accord basically wants to focus on how different climate financing can be done in order to reach the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. Now, what is the difference between net zero and carbon neutrality? As I said, both of these are identical terms, but there's a difference. Net zero basically talks about all different kinds of greenhouse gas emissions and not just the carbon based emissions. However, carbon neutrality is the basic term that talks about carbon based emissions only. But when we talk about all the greenhouse gases, they're not just carbon based. For example, we have ozone, which is O3. So we have nitrous oxide and so many other zero is more of a wholesome and a more generic term that talks about all different kinds of greenhouse gas emissions, while carbon neutrality means that we are focusing on carbon-based emissions only. So when we talk about both of these, to ensure that the amount of carbon dioxide or carbon related emissions or greenhouse gas emissions that are being produced by an organization are equivalent to the amount of greenhouse gases that are being removed from the environment. And as a result, the total sum of the emissions by that organization needs to be zero. The next assessment criteria wants us to talk about how different international as well as national drives, commitments, and initiatives are working. Why are they working and what are basically striving for? They are moving towards this goal of climate crisis solution, and they also want to work on this net zero agenda under the Paris Accord. So we have many countries, over 140 countries, over 9,000 companies, over 1,000 cities, many educational institutes, many financial institutions, all of those working for this race to zero, which is basically a coalition. It is like that many countries and organizations and cities and many financial institutions have come together to create this institution, which is called the Race to Zero. And the goal, obviously, is to move towards a reduction of about 80%, 88% emissions that are being produced by different organizations and countries and financial institutions and cities and so on. The next assessment criteria, three of them have been connected because these are similar to each other. So we want to work on net zero urgency. We want to talk about net zero pledge and what are the risks related to net zero. So we say that the urgency of the net zero means that we need to immediately work on front-loaded emissions and we need to reduce these as soon as possible. So we need to have some really comprehensive and brief targets, but all of those targets needs to be very complete. We also want to talk about how carbon dioxide can be consciously and very carefully removed from the environment and how carbon offsets can be done in the environment. And then we also want to keep sustainable development in hand, because these two cannot to transit. We are working towards net zero urgency. We are having net zero pledge, and that we also want to deal with the risks related to how social, economic, and ecological sustainability can be achieved in light of the agenda. When we want to talk about the next assessment criteria, it is that we want to identify what scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions are. So we have talked about 1, 2, and 3 scope greenhouse gas emissions a lot of times throughout this diploma, but I will be explaining it just a little today too. So we say, for example, if we are a steel mill, the scope 1 emissions related to the steel mill will be because of the activities that the steel mill is having directly, for example, because of the manufacturing and production activities that it is having. But the scope 2 emissions will be that, for example, a coal power plant is being used to generate electricity that is being used by the steel mill for heating and cooling purposes in order to produce air conditioning services to the steel mill. The scope 3 emissions will mean that these emissions are the ones that are produced in the upstream as well as downstream because of certain activities that happened even before the steel mill was there. So, for example, for the production of steel, we had to mine and we had to extract iron, and then we had to move to the steel mill production activities. After the transport and all of that, we after the manufacturing inside the steel mill was eventually disposed of at the end of the cycle downstream process, which is basically the process which leads to emissions, and all of these will be concluded in the scope 3 emissions. Talking about the next assessment criteria, when we talk about scope 3 emissions, these are the most difficult to calculate and the most difficult to reduce as well. So how do we reduce the scope 3 emissions? So any organization, if it wants to reduce its scope 3 emissions, it will have to first of all prioritize these, and then it will talk about how in the supply chain it can be optimized, it can be harnessed, and it can be maintained. Number 3, we want to have our employees, we want to have our members of the organization, our stakeholders understand this process and how their behavioral change can be of so much importance for scope 3 reductions. And then we want to have this throughout the entire supply chain from production to the very end, to the consumption point. We want to reduce the scope 3 carbon dioxide emissions. And then we also want to measure these and report these side by side. Talking about GHG accounting, and it's important to corporations and their stakeholders. So if you want to have GHG accounting, you will have to go through this process, which is number 1. You will be collecting data the first. Then you will be calculating your greenhouse gas. You will be coming up with certain results, and then you will be reporting and communicating those results to your stakeholders or to the concerned organizations and institutions so that the specific action can be taken. The next assessment criteria is also very much related to greenhouse gas accounting. It is called greenhouse gas inventory. So when we talk about greenhouse gas inventory, we say that you will have to firstly understand the scope of the greenhouse gas emissions and plan your inventory on light of those. And then you will be collecting the data and calculating with the help of certain calculations what your GHG emissions are and where are they being produced from. And your GHG inventory management plan is the one which is the basic and most important point of this. As a result, by the end of this process, you will set a target for yourself and for the future, for in order to be more sustainable in the future and to reach your net zero emissions goal, you will have to track your progress side by side. So in this picture that has been provided in this slide, I have talked about how the Apple company's greenhouse gas inventory showed certain results. So it shows that the greenhouse gas emissions of the Apple company is this much of metric tons, and the most amount of greenhouse gas emissions is being produced because of its manufacturing and product usage process. Now, how do we calculate greenhouse gas emissions? What are the different calculations that you will have to perform as an organization? So as a help the organization reduced by any activity to the emission factor. Or in the second step, you will multiply the amount of emissions that you have for certain activity to the global warming potential, which is basically a standard for every single activity that you have been provided. And as a result, the total emissions for that activity can be calculated in carbon dioxide equivalent tons. Now, what is greenhouse gas emissions and how that leads to global warming and climate risks. So this is basically something that we have been learning as environmentalists from the very start. We know that the greenhouse gas phenomena basically forms kind of a cloud outside the atmosphere, or forms a cloud outside the Earth's atmosphere, due to which the sun rays that enter inside the atmosphere of the Earth remain there for the longest of time. They keep reflecting back and are not able and are not allowed to leave the Earth's atmosphere. As a result, the temperature around the Earth is increasing. Hence, global warming, or this catastrophic change in temperatures that we are experiencing these days. And nowadays, since we are in June 2024, we all of us are witnessing the greatest amount of temperature is increase. For example, we witnessed a temperature increase of about 52 degrees in Makkah during the Hajj, and a lot of influence has been observed. The next assessment criteria talks about decarbonization plans. So a decarbonization plan works by, first of all, you will have to, an organization will have to create a baseline for themselves, that this is the line after which I do not want to emit anymore. I want to basically create a reduction plan for myself, that this is the amount of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that I want for my organization. And this is how much I need to come back. This is how much I need to remove my greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. And thus, as a result, you will have to report and communicate the carbon plan that you have come up with. So these decarbonization plans can be short term, medium term, and long term as well. So for example, this is basically an example. Do not be very much complicated by the picture. It's very easy. I will explain it to you. So this shows that, for example, we are in 2024. So basically, in this year, if you want to set up a goal for 2022, which is basically the year that we are in, we will have to have a short term goal which stretches over maybe 6 months or maybe 4 months. And the next, if we want to talk about the medium term targets, we say that we want to have a target of emission reduction until 2030. And this is the year by which I want to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. So you are keeping small baby steps for your organization, because we want to keep it real and we want to keep it achievable. And then a long-term goal, an example of a long-term goal is that the organization will say that I want to reach the goal of zero emissions by 2050, which is basically a difficult goal, and it's also a long-term goal. The next assessment criteria talks about what science-based targets are. So basically, there's an organization called Science-Based Targets Initiative, also known as SBTI, and it has developed a very comprehensive strategy on how you can achieve your science-based targets. So first of all, it has given these 5 steps. First of all, you will have to commit, you will have to come up, you will have to stand up for your organization, and you will have to come to this SBTI and tell them how you want to achieve a specific goal, you want to create a specific baseline for yourself, and you want to move in a specific direction. And then you will have to develop a plan, and that plan will be submitted to SBTI. And then afterwards, after that plan has been basically passed by SBTI, you are allowed to communicate it to your stakeholders, or everybody who's working with, or any partners that you have, on how you want to keep this target for yourself and how you want to achieve it for yourself. And afterwards, this plan will be disclosed as to if you were able to achieve this target or not. So many companies are working with SBTI. A lot of those companies are having goals of that. 198 companies want to limit their emissions to 1.5 degrees. 148 companies, on the other hand, want to limit their emissions to 2 degrees. And many other organizations, that is 132 organizations, want to limit their emissions well below 2 degrees Celsius. And the basic goal that they have on an average is of 1.5 degrees reduction. The next assessment criteria again talks about decarbonization, but it wants to talk about different challenges related to decarbonization, what are the different problems associated to it, and how the present world, the different economies, different countries, different institutions and organizations are having problems and challenges and risks related to decarbonization. So two of these will be explored. One of these is called a carbon bubble. As shown in the picture, you can see that the red bubble shows a carbon bubble and the blue bubble shows the safe carbon budget that you have. For example, an organization says that I have a plan, I want to invest in non-renewable resources of energy such as coal, oil, and natural gas, and it has already invested in these, and it thinks that I will be producing energy based on these non-renewable resources of energy, and then about 2.795 billion tons of carbon dioxide will be produced. This is basically an estimate that can be made based on how much investment on coal, oil, and natural gas that that organization has made. However, if we keep on moving with the same motivation for net zero and carbon neutrality, we can say that this carbon bubble can be bursted and the organization can limit its emissions to 565 billion tons of carbon dioxide by 2050. And this is basically how we can limit the global warming below 2 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial levels. And this carbon bubble can be bursted. And a lot of loss, financial loss, will have to be faced by those organizations. Talking about the next picture, it shows the concept of stranded assets. So in this picture, you can see that this person is basically stranded on the tip of a rock. So it says that the organizations that have already invested in non-renewables will have to face the problem of stranded assets, and they're basically in a lot of danger. The next assessment criteria is that how environmental communication can be done. Do we have any standards and regulations in today's world on environmental communication? Yes. So we have certain standards and regulations such as the CAP, which is basically the criteria that talks about basic promotion and advertisement strategies on how organizations need to be very much aware of their green advertisements and promotions, and any problem and malfunction related to this will be checked. And then another regulation is Green Claims Code. And then we have ISO 1463 2020 environmental communication. And then the ICC framework, which talks about how your organization's marketing and communications need to be very, very responsible. Otherwise, you will have to face penalty. So as basically a consultant for an organization, you can tell the organization how your communication or the activities that the organization is having needs to be very much under these standards and regulations. Otherwise, penalties will have to be faced. And these are the partner organizations that this organization can have. The next assessment criteria talks about a very interesting term, which is an interesting term, which is greenwashing. So we heard about whitewashing and so on, but this term greenwashing is a new one, but it's very interesting. So greenwashing means that an organization is having all the bad activities, is polluting the atmosphere, is having all the different impacts on the environment, but it claims to keep a very green and sustainable facade as shown in this picture. So this is how you hide your activities. That is how you put a face and you act like someone you're not. We have a tremendous amount of examples from today's world. We have Coca-Cola, we have Pepsi, we have Apple, we have so many other organizations that claim to have moved towards climate sustainability, but are pretty far away from that. For example, we talk about how the company Volkswagen, it basically had a scandal in which it said that we are having a very clean vehicles, we're having clean vehicles, but it was found out that the organization has basically installed a software in their vehicles, as a result of which, whenever the vehicles were being tested in the laboratory by any other organization, the the vehicles will go on basically a safe system in which their real picture will not be shown. The real amount of emissions that they have, that the vehicle has, that the car has, will be hidden, as a result of which it will come out as passed in the laboratory test. But when it was found out that the organization was using this safe software, the organization has to face a lot of penalties. The owner has had to go to jail. This is a prime example of greenwashing. And similarly, Coca-Cola says that it will be moving to plastic friendly bottles. It will be moving to environment friendly bottles. But we can imagine the amount of plastic bottles that Coca-Cola and companies like Pepsi are producing on a daily basis. The next assessment criteria is 5.1 to 5.5, focus on climate change adaptation in different forms. The first goal that we want to talk about is climate change adaptation and resilience. By climate change adaptation and resilience means that we want to have certain procedures, frameworks, and activities, future plans that make sure the climate change is reduced. We want to have certain technological innovations. We want to reduce the impact that our machinery or processes have, and we want to have to work on different trends or technological innovations that it has. For example, we have different green innovations, we have sustainable machines, we have sustainable processes in today's world that are leading to better climate change adaptation. And then we have certain barriers and vulnerabilities and risks related to climate change adaptation that cannot be ignored. For example, we have social barriers, we have political barriers, we have financial barriers, monetary barriers, above all, that one party wants to work on climate change reduction, but the basic problem related to that, it will lead to lesser profit generation, as a result of which those goals are completely ignored, which is basically what is happening in today's world at the moment. Climate change financing talks about how different smaller parties and organizations can be financed so that they can move towards their sustainable goals. And then different international agreements such as the Paris Accord and the COP26 and so on are working towards climate change adaptation. So the next assessment criteria is on geoengineering. So geoengineering is basically how different trends, technological trends, are being used in order to deal with climate change. So for example, we have this process of carbon capture and sequestration. We have been using the method of afforestation, and we have been replanting forests. We have been using space reflectors, which are basically used to reflect the sun rays so that the amount of temperature that can rise in the world can be limited. And then we have stratospheric aerosols, which are basically produced for a cooling effect so that the sun rays can be reflected back. And again, albedo enhancement is basically a phenomena in which, because of the shining impact, the sun rays are reflected back. And then we have enhanced weathering inside the oceans. And the biochar, which is basically also known as coal char, or the charcoal, or basically produced from organic materials, and can be used in agriculture and other processes in a more safe manner to reduce the impacts of climate change. So with this, we come to the end of the presentation, talking about submission and citation. So basically, the assessment number 6, that is of unit number 6, it is of a little bit of a different nature. So you will have to talk about the learning outcomes 1, 4, and 5, and create a report out of those in 2,500 words. But talking about the learning outcomes 2 and 3, you will have to create a specific separate essay of 2,000 words for those. Altogether, you will have to work on 4,500 words, but this will be submitted in one document, in one Word document, and will be submitted to the assessor. So do you have any questions? I hope not. So thank you so much for attending the session, everybody. It was a pleasure. We talked about unit number 6, which is advanced principle of net zero. Talked about its aims. We talked about different assessment criteria that it had. We talked about the concept of net zero. We talked about the concept of carbon neutrality, about greenhouse gas emissions accounting, about greenhouse gas inventory, decarbonization, and so on. By this, we come to the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for attending. Allah Hafiz.